Hello everyone, today is January 31st of the 2012 year, and I am Curtis Awmaface. I don't know why I have my last name there, but my last name is also Holman. And today we're going to be talking about TVP in this episode of Terran It Up. This is going to be our third episode, so yay for that. Technically our fourth, but let's not get into my little failed attempts at a prelim. And, I mean, previously I've talked about just the 5-minute Terran, then we talked about just a single unit, and just to kind of mix things up, I want to actually talk about a matchup. And then probably next week I'll talk about an individual unit again, or something to worry about related to like getting +1s or something like that. But today is all about TVT and when you're Terran, if you scout your Protoss, what you can do, what unit compositions to go for, and if you're Protoss watching this, look at the strengths and weaknesses that I'm pointing out from the Terran perspective, and then you can use that to your own ability to kind of abuse the Terran. So here we go, all that fun stuff. Terran It Up, match number 3. And I want to start off right now with a pop quiz. So if you don't need to get a pen and paper out or anything like that, but last episode what we talked about exclusively were tanks. And I talked about the breakdown of how much resources it takes to do, kind of rules of thumb of how many factories you can support per base, and so on and so forth. So I just want to ask very simple questions here. Number 1, what are the costs of the tanks? And what I mean by the cost, I mean the mineral, the gas, and supply. And for a little extra credit, you can even write in the amount of time it takes to make a tank. Question number 2 is the range of the attack, and this is both for the unsieged and wall sieged modes. And number 3 through 5 are just kind of matchup usage. Throughout the entire weekly, we talked about a little bit of how to use it effectively, and especially if you scout a certain unit composition, how to use it. So I'm going to give you about, maybe 20 more seconds before I unveil some answers. And while I unveil them, especially for 3 to 5, the questions 3 to 5, obviously I don't have everything filled out, so you could still write down something that is correct. But these are also just kind of general guidelines. And hopefully I talked enough to give you enough time to jot down a few things, so I'm just going to move on to the answer questions. Very simply, for question 1, tanks cost 150 minerals, 125 gas, and cost 3 supply. And for the extra credit question, which isn't written down, it takes 45 seconds for a tank to come out of that factory. For question number 2, an unsieged tank has a range of 7, while a siege tank in siege mode has a range of 13. And we talked about how to use Vikings and other air units and even the Xel'Naga watchtowers to increase that sight range to maximize the tank's efficiency in siege mode. Number 3 was related to in TVT. So if your opponent is making a lot of Marines in the siege mode, before Marines get combat shield, if they stim, it brings down their hit points enough that it takes 1 volley to kill Marines. Reapers it's also very good at, just to be unsieged, because Reapers will do a grand total of like 4 damage per shot, while the siege tank is going to plug in, 15 per second. So just having 1 static tank can block 5 to even 7 Reapers rushing in your base. And tanks, obviously, of course, are very good against Hellions for the same reasons that Hellions will do a grand total of like 0 damage against tanks. In TVP, which we'll break down a little bit more today, tanks are very effective versus Stalkers because both they're unsieged and in siege mode they do increased damage to armored units, and Sentries, because Sentries, one of the feared abilities for Terran is the force field of cutting off their troops and everything else. But if a Sentry tries to force field a tank, it does essentially absolutely nothing, because in siege mode you should still be able to range into the sentry fire, while also the sentries have such few hit points that the sentries will go down fast, and then your Marines, Marauders, and whatever your army composition can rush in and finish it off. And then for TVZ, tanks are very effective versus Banelings, Roach, Hydra. And to be completely honest, tanks are really good against every single ground unit that the Zerg army has. So that's why Marine Tank is actually so popular in that matchup. But those are just kind of the pop quiz that I wanted to do. I've been thinking about doing that for a while, and so I did it, and I thought it was kind of fun. Breaks up kind of monotony rather than just, this is the daily, this is what we're talking about, blah, 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 blah. But now, we're talking about our today's topic of Terran versus Protoss. And we're going to discuss what to look for while scouting, what unit compositions to go for both the Terran and Protoss army, the trouble units that Terran units have versus the Protoss units, and then kind of just generic good units. And also in there we're going to talk about some basic builds that the Terran player can do from the start, and then you can react based on what you scout. I mean, very simple. I'm a very huge proponent of doing reactionary play, but also having a statistical mindset in place. And if you have no idea what I just said, you have to watch the Theory Crafting Thursday. Was it last week? It was either episode 3 or 2. The one with random variables, I talk about reactionary players and statistical players. So, moving on. So first off, what are we going to look for? Usually Protoss players have to decide if they're going to do gateway units, Stargate, or Robotics Bay. And why they have to at least open up that way is because it's just way too expensive for a Protoss army to start getting all 3 at once. So a very basic thing is either to do 3 racks, expand, and then transfer tech pass from there, or they're going to open up like Gate Robo Gate, and then they're going to have that gateway army, in which then you have to be afraid of Immortals and Colossi, and be weary that observers are going to be on the field. Or you can even scout that a Stargate's there. And why it's important is as soon as you see one of them, you can then eliminate what you have to prepare for. So if you see a Stargate, you don't have to be worried about an Immortal Rush right away, because he's putting all his resources in this Stargate. Same thing if you see like 6 gateways on 2 base, you probably don't need to worry about Void Rays busting into your base anytime soon, because it's just way too expensive for them to get, say, Blink upgrade and also Void Rays out on the field. Now once they get to 3 and 4 bases, they can support that, but early on scouting, we can kind of pin them on a build and then react accordingly. And so just looking at it again, mass gateway units, usually their unit composition are Zealot Stalkers, Sentries, High Templars, DTs. Out of the Stargate, they can produce the Void Rays, Phoenixes, and Carriers. And usually if they do either the Stargate or the Robotics Blade, they're going to have a few Sentries to hold off any of early Marine Marauder kind of busts, to buy them time to get their big units. And then obviously the Robotics Bay, you have the Immortal and Colossi. And I don't have it listed here, but the Observer, and that's going to do a lot of scouting information. And the Warp Prism, which more and more it's going to be used more. I mean, some pros have used it a lot more, such as Liquid Hero, or is it Liquid Hero, or yeah, I think it's Liquid Hero or OGS, one of them. He's part of a combined team, so it's kind of confusing. But those are just kind of the simple things to look for, and in our examples we can try to pin people on builds and all that fun stuff. In the first breakdown, we have the mass gateway units. So the first thing, if you're going to start planning a build at all, you have to worry about this 4-gate. And as soon as you can hold off a 4-gate, that means you can hold off a 3-gate, and so on and so forth. And what you have to be prepared with when you're theory crafting your own build is around the 550 mark, somewhere around there. That's after the first warp-in of the 4-gate, essentially, and then pressure is going to be on. So you either have to have bunker support, Marauders with concussive shell, or something around those lines, around like the 530 mark, to be really prepared for it. I think the fastest gateway now can happen like around 530, maybe a little before then or a little after. But most of the timings that I've seen, usually the first warp-in is at 545, so it takes roughly 5 seconds then to get to your base, because they're going to have that proxy pylon. With the 3-gate, they can still have that proxy pylon, and you just still need to be aware of around that 550 mark that you're going to need something to stop either stalkers and zealots, and then maybe even 1 or 2 sentries in your build. And some things to stop the 4-gate are to throw down bunkers, and you really have to rely on these Marines and Marauders, because if you're even going for tanks, you're going to be holding off the battle for a little bit before your first tank comes out, and then it's still not going to have siege. So you're going to have to really hold it off if you're going to want to hold it off with siege tanks. Another mass gateway is the 6 or 7 gate, and this timing hits around the 9-10 minute mark, depending on if they went like gate nexus cyber, they got all their gateways, or if they did 3-gate pressure and then that got their nexus. But essentially the 6 or 7 gate, they need to be at least on 2 bases to really do it. And basically the same thing, bunkers, Marines, Marauder, medevac, you should be able to have out your first wave of medevacs, and then in this clump we can use tanks now because it's still later on. You should have your siege research done around like the 7-minute and 10-second mark, somewhere around there, and at that point you'll have 2 tanks with siege and your 3rd tank is on the way. And also Ravens can be very helpful to throw down that point defense drone to pick off any of the stalker shots to really hold off any of that. Or if you're on the offensive, throw down that PDD offensively and just watch your Marine Marauders just clean up. Also under the mass gateway we have the High Templar. Getting the High Templar on 1 base is a little more atypical. It can happen, and the big thing you have to worry about is around like the 8 to 9 minute mark is when Storm finishes, and that's when it becomes scary. But if you see a very fast High Templar kind of rush, just get Marauders, ultimately get Ghosts and tanks. Ghosts will do their EMP, and tanks actually, even if they're sieged up and get hit with a full storm, they're still going to be alive. I think it may even take 3 storms to kill a tank, just because tanks have so much hit points compared to Marines and other really weak units. But what's more common is the DTs, and this was very, very, very popular when StarCraft 2 first came out, and it's coming back a little bit, is the DT expand. And even in the GSL, DT expands have been coming back into fashion every once in a while. It's almost like, think of it as a Reaper expand. Reaper expands still happen, it's still a good build and all that stuff, but it's just not as popular right now if you follow the meta at all. But DTs, you need to start worrying about them around the 7-minute mark. I think they really start hitting you around the 7:30 mark. And so usually what you have is you either have orbital scans to hold them off, Ravens, and if you got a fast eBay like around the 6 or 6:30 mark, you can even get a turret up to defend your front either at the natural or even throw them up in your main mineral lines if you're even afraid of warp prism drops and all that fun stuff. And what's really good against any of the really early mass gateway units is to do Banshee harass. Since I know you're thinking, but they're going to have stalkers to pick off my Banshees and blah, 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 blah. But what Banshees have, not only the cloak ability, which then forces the Protoss player to make an observer or some form of detection. Rarely will they make cannons nowadays. But stalkers cannot chase your Banshees where there is no land. So even just having one Banshee just in range of sight of those stalkers, you're essentially, think of it as chess, if you've ever played chess, in which you can pin a piece. In which a classic example is like to pin a knight. And what pinning essentially means is, how can I describe this? So, I wish I had a picture ready. Pinning a piece, the pin piece, if it moves, will then checkmate you, essentially. So it's a move that's blocking your king from being captured. But if it moves, then it's no longer blocking, and then technically your opponent can win. But that's not a legal move to do, hence it's called pinning. A lot like in StarCraft 2, you can pin those stalkers, even though they can move. like it's legal for the stalkers to be like, we'll leave the Banshees alone, and then the Banshees come in and kill probes or pick off tech or something of that nature. It's going to just kind of split up that Protoss army, and especially with mass gateway units, or like even when they start getting this death ball, you want to slowly just start kind of stretching them apart, a lot like Laffy Taffy or Doe, just kind of split them up, because then they're going to be a lot weaker to pick off. That's why drops later on are so effective versus Protoss. But we'll go into that. So using early Banshee harassment can be really effective. Even if you go Rax Command Center, you can still tech up to Banshees and still be a huge nuisance if they're going for this kind of mass gateway play. Next, I have the Stargate. Going a Stargate build is a little less popular nowadays. It's more considered all-in-ish. Excuse me. I still think Stargate play is completely 100% viable. And why I think that is, if a Protoss player has ever heard this following sentence, he 1-1-1'd me, well, a Void Ray Rush actually beats out the 1-1-1. So if you were just non-stop, every single Terran you found on the ladder, that like one after another, is just like, oh, Manzel Naga again versus a Terran, he's going to 1-1-1 me. I want you to instantly just say, well, I'm just going to Stargate him, because I'm going with the mindset, I'm going to kill him before he does a scary push that I'm afraid of. Pretty simple. Yeah, it may be considered all-in-ish, but really it's all about winning in the very end. So you can, make your 3 observers get hit by the 1-1 and then call OP and BS and all that other bullshit. Or you can just kill them. I mean, it's up to you. But essentially for the Terran kind of perspective is usually you're probably not going to scout the Void Rush. They're going to have really early harassment of stalkers and all that other fun stuff, which is going to usually force you to make some Marauders or something to deal with them. And why that's really good for the Protoss army is because Marauders can't shoot up. No matter how hard the Marines try to piggyback them and all that fun stuff, Marauders will never be able to shoot Void Rays. Unless Blizzard responds to my gunship idea, which I want in Heart of Swarm. But that's for another time. And basic things to really hold off Void Ray rushes are Marines. You have to use Marines. That is your one critical thing to pick them off. It's the very early unit, Tier 1 unit, that actually shoots up. And Marines are pretty good, essentially, to everything. Turrets are very effective. And then the Viking. Vikings can actually kite the Void Rays, but be a little careful, because if you get too close, Void Rays can shoot while running. So if they get into that kind of medium range and start charging up on your Vikings will die very fast. But you can micro them, and Vikings will pick off all of the Void Rays. And also a very common thing, if you're a type of Terran player that wants to do this Rax Command Center, you can hold off a Void Ray push. You do need to use bunkers and turrets. And the most effective way is to have a turret literally adjacent to your bunker. And if you were kind of denied a lot of information while scouting out when you're doing all this fun stuff, even having that turret down next to that bunker is going to help you fight off not only the Void Ray pushes, but it's also going to help you with any of the DT things. Because if you look at the time with the Void Ray, it hits around the 730 mark if you're pushing with 2 Void Rays, which I have an example of, which hits around the 730 mark, or around the 730 mark. But the DTs also hit around the 7 to 730 mark. So it's a very effective thing to have your turrets up by your bunkers, especially if you're doing a more economic opening, to just defend against any of that really annoying harassment or all-in scenarios. And as I has here, scouting can be really effective. If you scout or proxy Stargate, you can use all your Marauders, your Reapers, whatever, because they're going to be able to target down the pylons to power the Stargate, and then make the Stargate essentially a giant paperweight in the middle of the map or in the corner or something like that. The alternative is to do a big Marine opening. So either to open up 3 naked racks or do the Rax command center and then throw down 2 more Raxes or 3 more Raxes and just really crank them out to hold off not only like a 3-gate follow-up, but also to hold off the Void Rays. And then last but not least, the robotics kind of openings. And why I have this last of the 3 builds is because versus Terran, this is probably the most popular. Because Cloaked Banshees were so evil and prevalent in TVP, it became a very standard thing for Protoss players to do Gate Robo Gate, hence the guild Gate Robo Gate. And they can transition to go up to 3 gates on one base. They can expand after Gate Robo Gate. They can even do Gate Expand Robo Gate. All sorts of fun variations, but the principle still remains. If you scout an early robotics bay, so if they went Gate Robo Gate and you still had your SCV running around because you're macroing him like a boss, you need to then be worried about 2 things. You need to be worried about an immortal push that's coming, and it usually hits around the 8-minute mark. It could hit a little bit more if they want to just push with 1 immortal. Sometimes they wait up till they have up to 5 immortals, and then obviously it'll be a later time. Some units that Terran are really effective versus our immortals are Marines, of course, because the hardened shields of immortals aren't affected by Marines. And then Banshees, simply because immortals can't shoot up. And if a Protoss player is using all of their gas essentially to make immortals, they're not going to have a large sentry force to battle your Banshees. And so your Banshees have a bigger free reign to kind of poke and prod. Now later on, 1-base Colossus is very faux pas nowadays, but it still happens. Usually Colossus though are on 2-base. And for the Terrans, you usually start making a lot of Marauders and Vikings. Vikings is the very clutch unit in this kind of unit composition matchup. That's why a lot of Protoss may make a Colossi to show like, hey Terran buddy, I'm making Colossi, to kind of make the Terran player afraid to make, 8-16 Vikings, but then the Protoss buddy just doesn't make another Colossi, and then the Vikings completely destroy the one Colossus and they all high-five, and then they realize they're being shot by stalkers and all that stuff from below, and then storms happen, and then Terrans cry. So you don't want paperweights, and you don't want to just kind of overreact making Vikings. This needs to be a constant kind of checks and balances of poking and prodding with like the few Vikings you had to get a better accurate count on their Colossus count, or to just scan their army and get a count saying, do I need to make more Vikings, or can I go back to making medevacs, and so on and so forth. And then just in general, versus most robotics play, drops are very effective. A lot like how we talked about Banshees are effective versus gateway units, we can use drops in the same manner. It's going to split up the robotics army, which Immortals and Colossi are relatively slower than the Stalkers. And so if you hit them in the back of their base and their entire army's in the front, it's going to take them a long time to come back to try to defend it and hold it off. And of course, since you're doing these drops, luckily you can be able to pick off a pylon, and if you're really lucky, you can even pop out the robotics facility or the robotics bay, and that will give you a huge opportunity to then even get a third or even tech up a little bit more as a Terran player for a follow-up. If you snipe something with one of your drops, do not rush in with your entire army. You are guaranteed to lose your entire army and then lose the game because of it. It's all about follow-ups. The same thing with pinning units with Banshees. It's all about follow-ups. Don't try to win the game because you have 3 stalkers pinned in the back. You're just delaying and splitting their army and making their Protoss feel more uncomfortable. And that brings us to Terran openings. If we are on ladder and we finally see a TVP, what do we do? What's growing, I think, more and more popular in the higher ranks is doing a 1 Rax fast expand. Since usually you can transition making a lot of Marines out of it to defend any of the Void Ray pushes. You can, with some difficulty, hold off a 3-gate or 4-gate type of thing as long as you get bunkers down in time. but it's a relatively popular opening. And it's essentially self-explanatory. You get 1 Rax, and then as fast as possible, you get that command center. And then getting gas on that build is a little up to your play style. If you want to go up to 6 Rax on 2 bases, go ahead, and you don't need that extra gas. Now, as soon as you get that second command center, and you want to tech up to Cloak Banshees, then you need to take 2 gases nearly immediately, even before the factory, because you want to get that tech path going. Completely up to your play style. Also, which is the most popular, is this 2 Rax, in which you get 1 reactor on your first barracks, and then 1 tech lab on your second barracks, and you just do a little poke with it. And then depending on what's going on, you can either expand behind it or tech up. The example that we're going to show after this little slideshow is a 2 Rax, 1 base play on Xel'Naga, not Fortress, Caverns. The third option is to do the Marine Tank Banshee push, or more commonly known as the 111 on the North American server, in which you get a reactor on your barracks to pump out a lot of Marines. You get a tech lab on both your factory and starport, and you usually push with in between 3 and 6 tanks with siege mode and 2 to 4 Banshees and a shit ton of Marines. You can bring a handful of SCVs if you want to do a bunker kind of variation. You can bring all of them if you want to do the straight all-in variation. You can bring none at all. Completely up to you. Also, the Marauder expand I think is very, very good for anyone Platinum and under, because usually around that division your mechanics aren't going to be up to snuff, usually, and the Protoss players on that level are probably going to do a lot of 4-gating or 3-gate variations. So getting that very fast Marauder out and very fast concussive shell is going to essentially save you all that trouble. And then if you get that expansion up after holding off and getting some map control with the concussive shell Marauders, you're going to be leagues ahead of your Protoss opponent. What's still also very viable, we talked about the Cloak Banshees, and you can outright punish someone if they are doing that kind of mass gateway play. You can even start pinning units. Even if they do a gate robo gate, you can force one of their observers to non-stop be by your Banshee, and all you can do with your Banshee is you just sit out of range. And just having your Banshee there, yeah, it's eating up some of your supply and things like that. You probably even got cloak, so you wasted a lot of resources getting that. But you force that Protoss player to get an observer to non-stop be by your Banshee, so you're denying scouting information, and you're probably pinning a few units as well. So Cloak Banshee openings are still completely viable in TVP. And then of course the 3 Rax, which I think I did my first Terran It Up on. 3 Rax, do not expect to win with it. 3 Rax is more for punishing a fast expanding Protoss. On most maps, the maps aren't going to have a narrow choke to their natural, and so force fields are going to be a lot more difficult to use to kind of stop this very strong Marine Marauder force that's coming at the Protoss player. And effectively, I do not encourage bringing all your SCVs to a Protoss player, because in most cases they're just going to pull off all their pros from their natural, throw them in their main, and they're just going to keep force fielding their main ramp and just sacrifice the Nexus. No big deal, and they should be able to stabilize and push down and all that fun stuff later on. So don't expect to win. If you're going to 3 Rax, you're going to try to do a 3 Rax expand variation, which you push up because you've already scouted that they've taken either like a Nexus first, a Gateway Nexus, or Cybercore Nexus kind of build. You're going to snipe the Nexus, kill any units that want to stay around. You can try to like just look up the ramp, and if you see no sentries, run up. If you see 1 sentry, run away. You can try to do a soft contain, you can build a few bunkers, but really the ultimate goal that you're just trying to have is just to snipe the Nexus and get out of there, since you're sniping their Nexus and you're building your own command center, so technically you're up on a base, or you're a little bit more ahead of getting expansion than him, and that's all you're trying to do in a 3 Rax variation. Also, I highly recommend doing a 3-Rax if you're like a platinum or less player, especially if you're gold or less, to do that. So just looking back real quick, let me grab one of my pointers. I highly recommend, if you are platinum or under, to do one of these 3 bottom builds. If you are platinum and better or something like this is a much tighter build, the 111. So it's a little bit harder to do, but it can be very effective. 2-Rax, you can start doing platinum and even diamond, but you're going to even be able to see masters and grandmasters do this build. And then the 1-Rax fast expand. Only do it if you're platinum or higher. You can start messing with it when you're platinum, but don't expect to win a lot of games, because if you get 4-gated, don't blame me. You need to scout it and throw down bunkers faster to hold off any of that shenanigans. But ultimately, it comes down to essentially these 3 builds. Oops. Let me actually change my color if I can. In color, I think you use like a gray. Let me get a blue. That should stand out a lot more. Yeah, a little bit more. So basically, any of these 3 builds to do if you're platinum or higher, and leave the last 3 for platinum and lower. And for your play style, this is essentially the determining factor. If you're more the person that wants to do a very fast expansion kind of build and macro up and try to win that way, do this build. If you want to be much more reactionary and kind of punish a lot of fast expansions, then do a 2-Rax pressure. You should still be able to either get an expansion afterwards or even tech up to metavax on 1 base or really anything. But this is a much more offensive opening, while this is more of a powering up based on the triangularity theory. So it's basically your choice. Very flexible builds, neither of them are all-ins or too risky to do, but those are just sample openings you can do versus TVP. And then even just talking about those simple openings, we're looking at the final unit compositions, or our mid-game unit compositions. And the first thing that we have to answer is if we are going for a more bio play, which are clearly your Marine Marauder, Ghosts, Reapers types of things, anything made out of the barracks, or if you're going for more of this tech play, which are your Hellions, tanks, and Thors. And this is essentially all for your play style as well. There's no wrong way to do it. Some maps are better for one build. Like if you have a lot of tight chokes, tech play is really good. If you have a lot of open spaces and a lot of distance to cover, bio play is a little bit better because they're faster, so they're able to transverse the map faster. But completely up to you of what to go for. Bio play, you're obviously going to do your standard Marine Marauder Medevac versus Protoss, and then ultimately later game is to grab these Ghosts, because they're going to help against the High Templar, Mass Stalkers. Oh man, I love writing with my mouse. Stalkers, and even the Immortals. I know I spelled Immortal wrong, shut up. I do not recommend, as a rule of thumb, to get Ghosts before 3 bases. You can, and there are specialty builds out there that get a very fast Ghost. I just do not recommend it. It's too risky. It slows down other tech options, which are what I consider more flexible, and in fact then better. If you go Ghosts and they go mass gateways, you might be screwed unless you really hit all their sentries with an EMP, and that's like doing an if build and that you're really hoping that it's going to work. And I don't like that. I would much rather you essentially trade armies and get another expansion than for you to do this 1 or 2 base Ghost push, and if it fails, oh well. So that's just my take on it. You can get it on 1 base or 2 base, but I recommend waiting until you at least have 3 bases, since then you can start pumping out 3 Ghosts at a time and all that other fun stuff, rather than 1 Ghost at a time. It just eats up a lot of your early game barracks production, which you need. Just my personal opinion. And then if you decide to do more of this tech play, usually early on you can start doing Hellion drops, and you can even open up with a Marauder Hellion kind of opening. And then after you're done making a few Marauders, you can swap a factory onto the tech lab that was making this, and then use your barracks to then just expand. Because usually you can do the Marauder Hellion with 1 Rax, 1 factory. So then after you take your second base, or even still on 1 base, you can go up to 2 or even 3 factories as a transition to start doing more of this kind of tech play. Tanks play a huge role in taking out big stalker armies. They can even still outrange Colossi, and Colossi that stand on their units, that means tank splash damage is even better. But do not think for even a split second that tanks replace Vikings, because they do not. They do not ever, not in a million years replace Vikings, since they just don't. So even though there may be a third option of doing the Sky Terran kind of build, I don't recommend it at all doing in TVP. You can try it, be my guess. And the second reason I didn't have it listed is because no matter what, Viking, as I pointed out, is the reactionary unit to Colossi, and it's that checks and balances of making sure I don't have 16 Vikings for only 1 Colossus, or having 4 Vikings for 5 Colossus, which that is the scary number for Protoss to have versus Terran. So if you are doing this tech play, you can have, your tank line, probably can even do the Marine tank kind of standard play for Terran. Or you can do like the tanks Thors, and you then can use your Hellions as constant harass around the map, since they're fast units, and since most of the units you care about are gas orientated. So Hellions are just kind of eating away at the minerals that you have left over, and hopefully you can pick off probes and do harassment that way. It also forces the Protoss player to not make as many Zealots as they usually want. So then they're probably going to have a much more sentry, have much more of a stalker-centered army, in which then your tanks and Thors will do increased damage. But you need Vikings if you decide to either do bio play or tech play if they're going that Colossus route. If you don't, you're in a lot of trouble. And both plays of either bio or tech, you can even throw in a few Ravens here and there or a few Banshees, but it doesn't really dictate what you're doing. The big thing choosing the bio play and the tech play is what you're going to research. Since getting 3/3 upgrades out of your engineering bay, and then getting 3/3 upgrades out of your armory for your vehicles, and then maybe even getting them out of your ships or your air forces, that's a lot of resources that you could have just been pumping into making units. So that's why you have to kind of decide what you're going to do. Usually before you even do your first push. So like if you warp on a map and say, I'm going to do tech play on this, so I'm going to open up a Marauder Hellion push, and then I'm going to go into kind of tank Thor, or I'm going to get 3 Thors and then push out, type of thing. And then a few examples of timing pushes that that Terran has versus Protoss are the Marine Tank Banshee, or the 111 as we previously discussed. There are also Raven variations, there's Medevac variations, there's even some Marauders, you can even splash some Hellions in there, but the basic premise is these 3 units, the Marine Tank Banshee. And just to clarify, this 111, if you didn't know, is more related to the 1 Rax. Oh wow. 1 Rax, 1 factory starport, not Marine Tank Banshee. But I very much do not like calling this the 111, because 111 is essentially just a standard opening that Terrans have been doing since Brood War. And so to kind of generalize 111 to this specific timing push really bothers me. But that's just my own little gripes, and I'll just move on. Another big timing push that you can do is a Marine Thor Medevac SCV. This can be extremely annoying, 100% annoying to Protoss players. And if you don't think this is annoying, just go to one of your Protoss buddies and say, hey, I've been thinking about doing this Thor push and pulling a few SCVs to repair the Thors and having even just like 2 medevacs to support my Marines and the SCVs repairing the Thors and all that stuff. What do you think about it? And they'll probably just give you this really deep brow like, I hate you, do not do that to me. Thors can step over force fields, which eliminates the whole need or the whole fear of an early Marine push. And then your medevacs support your Marines and your SCVs. And then your Thors, usually you get +1 vehicle upgrade for this push. So then all the Zealots and everything else, the Thor just like doesn't die. And it's just this giant tank that steps on force fields, laughs, and then shoots with their giant cannons. Very effective timing push. You can even proxy the factory because Thors are so slow. Or if you're being really suave, you can have a medevac carry the Thors, and then as soon as you're getting ready to engage, you can drop the Thors and then engage. Just all little fun little tricks. But that's a fun little timing push that whenever I see it, I smile even though there are better things to do. And then the last timing push, as I went in a little more detail, the Marauder Hellion. And you can either do a drops for the Hellions, in which you can get a medevac out real quick. Dropper? Anyway, you can either do a medevac drop with these Hellions to then pull back Protoss armies to the back of their base. So let's just draw this, and then we have a ramp here, Nexus, and minerals, blah, 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 blah. So if the Protoss army is like down at the front of the ramp or like around here, and we drop Hellions here to then attack them behind their mineral line, they're going to have to pull their army back here to defend the Hellions, because Hellions do extra damage to probes, in which then will just completely annihilate your mineral line. So when the Protoss army is doing this, the Terran players then run up all their Marauders and their Marines or whatever to the front, in which then they've broken the line. And this is just more of a distraction, and hopefully even they pull out their sentries, in which then the Terran player is able to break this front. Excuse me. This can be really a helpful strategy if you're doing a contain. We're actually going to see this in action in a replay a little later on. Or you can even do more of a cheesy variation, which is, let me just clear this so I can start all over again. If you have a close air map, this is the Protoss base, and we're just going to make some minerals here and a Nexus. And this is going to be the Terran base, in which they're here, a few of these, make a pretty ramp, and a pretty ramp. Oh, I can just draw so well. Actually, this ramp is probably around here. But anyway, these are close air positions. The Terran player can actually lift off their factory and land it usually somewhere hidden in the base. It's really good if there's a smoke screen. And you can start making Hellions here, which then you do not need to get a medevac. And you do the same kind of Marauder push here. You move in with your Hellions to harass the line. They should pull back most of the Protoss forces to deal with it. And then your Marauders charge in to do damage. Really effective, really annoying. This is a very old school build of StarCraft 2, but it's still very viable, I think. Even if they scout the factory, they're going to pull their units back to deal with it, in which then you can still have a possible chance to break the front. Something to consider. It's your playstyle. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. I'm just giving you that option. Now we're going to talk about the trouble units. The trouble units, are a little out of order. I wanted to talk about the Sentry first, but I guess we'll just go in order. Trouble units, we have the High Templar, or HT, which I've been calling it throughout the little cast. And essentially, if you see High Templar, stay clear of making too many Marines. Marauders, it takes two storms to kill Marauders, I believe. And so High Templar need to use more energy to kill your Marauder army. And then Ghosts. Ghosts are the counter unit to High Templar, because an EMP will get rid of 100 of their energy, which is more than one of their storms. Storm takes 75 energy out of the max 200 energy a High Templar can store. So if you see High Templar, you need to think nearly immediately, I need to get a Ghost Academy down to then start making Ghosts. And this reaction I do encourage you to do on 2 bases, because if they've gotten High Templar that fast, it means they don't have Colossi, which then you don't need to make Vikings as fast. So you can delay your starport, or even just make 1 medevac at a time rather than 2 medevacs at a time. So you can make 1 medevac and 1 Ghost at a time, and your gas should work out perfectly on 2 bases especially. For DTs, you can either get a Raven to carry around with your army, in which then DTs are just these giant pieces of paper in which Marines just spit on and then they die. Or you can start using scans and turrets to kind of detect the DTs. As I talked about before with the Rax expand, you can do the barracks turret combo, and that'll help versus not only DTs but also any void rays. And then sentries, which I think are the biggest thing, and a lot of my current Terran builds revolve around, if a Protoss does not get sentries fast, I punish them for it. Sentries are a huge, huge, huge trouble unit for Terran. Sentries can throw down force fields that can stop an entire push altogether in its tracks. It can cut off any bioforces trying to retreat, in which then cuts your army in half, essentially. So then the Protoss follow-up is even stronger. And then later on, if sentries are able to gather up a lot of energy, they can start doing guardian shields, which makes your Marines literally useless. I mean, shooting water guns would be more effective than Marines shooting a guardian shield unit. And some basic units that Terrans can do is you can do tanks, as we talked about with how tanks can outrange sentries. They do splash damage and they're not affected really by force fields because they're immobile anyways. Ghosts, if you can score an EMP, and Ghosts also do additional damage to light units, which a sentry is. You cannot snipe it with the Ghost ability snipe, but you can target it down a lot faster with Ghosts. And then Banshees, because again, force fields cannot affect Banshees, and Banshees I think 3 or 4 shot. What is it? I think they're 40-80 or some variation. So 2 and then 4. So I guess 6 shots roughly to kill a sentry. So if you rush in with 2 Banshees, that's 3 shots and you're good to go. And a lot of the times during a 1-1-1, if you can, for a split second with your Banshees, pick them off, I highly recommend targeting down these sentries, because it's going to make your Marines so much more powerful for that Marine tank Banshee push. Now we're going to go on to, I think, 3 more. Yes, we have 3 more trouble units. The Immortal. Mortals are very troublesome because they're able to take down bunkers extremely fast, and if you are a heavy Marauder army, they will be able to nearly 2-shot, since they do 50 damage per volley, and Marauders have 125 health. So be careful if you're doing like a Marauder expand or a 2 Rax. Don't overcommit to Marauders, since if they open up an Immortal and push with that 2 Immortal timing, or wait till they have up to 5 Immortals, they're just going to destroy your army like nothing was there and then walk all over you. But how to handle Immortals is just to make Marines, because they're not affected by the Hardened Shield, and Banshees. Even though the Banshee shot is reduced by 4 damage total, Banshees are able to outzone Immortals, and usually if your opponent's going Immortals, they don't have a lot of Stalkers to handle the Banshees. So you can target them down a lot faster with that way. Colossi, which are like the big scary unit, this is the checks and balances kind of unit. You have to be able to make Vikings equivalent to how many Colossi are out. not a 1-to-1 ratio. It's more of a, I would just rule of thumb say a 1-to-4 ratio. For every 1 Colossus, you need 4 Vikings. And 4 is the magic number with Vikings because I believe it takes 16 individual shots to kill a Colossus. That's why a lot of Terran armies get about 16 Vikings, because then you can start one-shotting Colossi down. So if it's like 16 Vikings versus 5, even though that's not the correct ratio, every single time the Vikings shoot, one of the Colossus dies. So very important to know. I wouldn't recommend ever having more than 20 or 22 Vikings at a time, because then it becomes a little redundant, and they just become giant flying paperweights. And then also getting Marauders. Marauders, if they're able to get in range, will just drop a Colossus extremely fast. So if you're going for that Marine Marauder medevac opening, and then you can just still get relatively good scouting information on how many Colossi they have, then you start working in the multiples of 4s with your Vikings per Colossi. And then last but not least is the Warp Prism. This is still, I think, growing in popularity. It's still extremely annoying, and it's more annoying late game. That's why we don't see it. A lot of players have started to try to use it either 1 base or 2 base as Protoss, but I think it's really effective once you start getting into 3 base, because you can literally have that Warp Prism warp in any units whenever. The most impressive response that I've seen of a Warp Prism is I was playing on the Korean ladder, and each of us were about 5 basing on Tal'Darim, and it was a long game of us constantly trading armies, losing an expansion here and there and whatever. But ultimately, we had this giant fight in the middle, and while this fight was going down, I'm trying to micro, so I'm watching my army, and I'm just going through, hitting 4A, 4D, tab, make more medevacs, oh, he has more Colossus, make Vikings, types of things. And as I was doing this, I heard, your base is under attack. And I even looked at my minimap, and sure enough, it pinged me in the middle of my base. And I was like, well, that's weird. And so, the battle was nearly over, and I finally looked over real quick, and he had a Warp Prism, and even though we were maxed army 200, whenever he lost one of his stalkers or any unit part of the big battle at home, he just warped in Zealots in the middle of my base to pick off any reinforcements that I was just queuing up. So he was utilizing that warp gate technology to really just punish me with that Warp Prism, which I was just so impressed with, and I think more Protosses need to do it. And how you really handle Warp Prisms is either straight Marines or Vikings. Vikings are the biggest enemy of Warp Prisms. But again, you don't want to just respond by making Vikings if you just see Warp Prisms. If he doesn't have Colossus, you can maybe pump out 2 Vikings to get a little more map awareness, but I wouldn't overdo it at all with Vikings. And then we're getting ready to wrap it up, and then we're going to look at just 2 replays real quick. The generic good units. A lot of time, like gold level players especially, or even some platinum players, they get to a certain point, they do their first push when it's held, or they did their economic build, and they hold off a push, and they're like, yes! What do I do now? And then their units shoot up, their gas is an astronomical number, and maybe they might take another third or whatever, but the minerals are so high, and then they ultimately lose. And usually what I hear is, well, I didn't know what to get. I didn't know what to build. And so I just wanted to talk about these generic units that, I didn't know what to do, so I'm just going to build these. This is just what I want you, they're the go-to units. They're not reactionary at all. They're just, I don't know what he has, my scouting has been bad, but I need to do something with my minerals and resources, so I'm just going to get these units. And essentially what I have here are the Marine Marauder and then the Banshee. These are the 3 most generic units that are good in essentially any situation. And that's why the Marine Tank Banshee push is so good, because 2 of the generic units are in there. This is why the, I had it. and I lost it. Oh, why Marine Marauder Medevac composition is so good? Because 2 of the units again are in there, and you can just keep pumping them out and to keep your minerals down and all that stuff. Why Raven isn't in here? Because it is situational. A Raven will do nothing if it's a heavy Zealot army. Vikings will do nothing if there's no Colossus, essentially. But these are the kind of standard go-to units. You can splash in some tanks here and blah 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 blah, but you don't want to overcommit making tanks, because then if your supply is hindered, you can't make those reactionary units. Hellions can be good for a little harassment, but it's a harassment unit, so I don't put that under a generic good unit. So this list, very short, concise, is more for those gold and under players that say, I don't know what to do, so just keep making these. Just throw them down. If you have 1,000 minerals, throw down 3 more barracks and just start making them. If your minerals are still growing high, throw down more and more barracks and just keep pumping out Marine Marauder. Your Banshees should be able to keep your gas low if you have even 2 to 4 kind of starports you can support. You can support 4 on 2 base if you do it just right, if you're just making Marines. And then in its own right can be a very scary composition to rush in there with a ton of Banshees and a ton of Marines. That is scary for a Protoss player. So I believe, yeah, that was my last slide, so I'm going to throw up the splash real quick, and I'm going to load up the first game that I want to talk about, which is, what I first want to go into is I want to look from the Terran perspective. Oh, hold on. You know the timing, but I guess that doesn't, no, stop it. We're going to look from the Terran perspective of how to do the 2 racks. Again, I talked about how the 2 racks, yeah, my sound is enabled. How the 2 racks can be a very effective build. I recommend it more for the kind of platinum and higher builds. But I just want to show it in action, speed it up a little bit because early game it's kind of boring. And effectively, you get the 10 supply depot, or racks on 12. And then gas on 13. And again, why I'm showing this specific one, this match just happened in the Purdue CSL, and Binsky Light is a, I don't know his individual rank, but he's a Grandmaster Terran who does this. So he should have a very tight build that I wanted to point out. I just didn't want to show either one of my replays or something else. I wanted to show a high-level Terran doing this build. Gas is done. As soon as it's finished, put 3 guys on it. There's a little probe harassment, which I forgot to tell the ultimate riddle. In TVP, how many SCVs does it take to build a barracks? No one knows! In this instance, it was 2. You may have thought, well, it just takes 1. I mean, it's just 1 SCV. 1 SCV can only build at a time. I mean, what is this, like War II or something? You can repair it to build it faster? For how many early harassment units, especially that Protoss can send out with that probe of just dropping down a pylon and not having to sit there or sacrifice themselves, they can just start running across the entire map and start harassment. And if you're a Protoss player, I 100% encourage you to harass early and harass often. Getting that early probe can be extremely annoying to block supply depot placements if they're doing a wall, like Binsky Light is doing in this game, or it's even just to pull off another SCV type of thing. Can just be really, really annoying, and if you're lucky enough to even snipe one of the SCVs, he has to replace that SCV to build the barracks, which delays his entire build, and then he has to pull out a 3rd SCV. So 1 barracks took 3 SCVs to build, and so on and so forth. It's just a fun little riddle. Oop, wrong little command. So the probe is doing its thing like you should have. We are going to see, and this is the kind of key thing, you want to begin your 2nd barracks before you get your 2nd supply depot to finish this wall off. It just makes it a very faster rush and you will be able to support it. Since why we're getting this such an early gas on 13 is because we want a very fast reactor. And so we're going to see this one Marine, and I believe he gets the reactor as soon as this Marine is out. So we're going to see a lift. Yep. Bam. And for the orbital command, just use the standard 16 timing. If you are still saying 15 is better, go on Team Liquid, and someone, I forget his name, did a big comparison that said the 16 orbital command is slightly better. Mathematics! But anyway, continue on. You should be getting, his second supply depot, which you usually get around 22 or 23 supply, depending on your build, which I talked about a little bit more in, I think, my first Terran It Up. As soon as the reactor's done, he's going to make 2 Marines, and as soon as this barracks done, he needs to make a tech lab. And there was 0 time in between. I'm actually just going to pause it now to see exactly what we scouted. And so this is the information that we have. We have this SCV that's looking for any fast nexus, so if he went like gate, cyber, and the nexus very fast, we would have this information of how to respond. We also know that he did in fact tech up to cyber core, and we left a little before we saw a second gas. And we're around the 420 mark, which is around the time we probably would have been chased out around the 510 mark. So as long as you work on your micro a little bit, you can get all that information to react to it. So we're going on, and we're going to see Marauder and Concussive Shell get started immediately out of here. Now, when to push out is completely up to you. There is a 1 Marauder variation, there is up to 3 Marauder variation, there's bring 2 SCVs, there's bring 0 SCVs, there's bring 6 SCVs, which we're going to see here. Completely up to you, and based on what you scout. If you scout a very fast kind of nexus, you're probably more inclined to push earlier and maybe even bring more SCVs. If he's staying one base for a lot longer, you're probably more inclined to wait a little bit more. But it's up to you to kind of find your style, if you like that really hyper aggression, or if you want to wait a little bit before big conflicts. And you can even do this 2 Rax opening and expand without even putting on pressure. I highly recommend at least poking in which means just bring your army here and seeing what's here, and then just pull away. Completely up to your playstyle. And we have the Union worker, which I also detailed, and he actually queued this up. And this is all that he's going to be doing. And Binsky Light took control of the towers with just 1 Marauder out, and Concussive Shell is done, and as soon as Concussive Shell was done, he finished stim. He's doing a stim variation. You can either get a factory once you get that Concussive Shell done to then tech up on 1 base. You could get combat shields right away. You can even get an early eBay up and start +1 there. Completely up to you. All variations are acceptable. But what he is doing is he's moving out with 2 Marauders, 6 Marines, and then a handful, looks like 7 Marines. I think I called the SCVs Marines, but 6 SCVs, 7 Marines is what he's pushing out with. And why he's bringing the SCVs? For 2 reasons. First, they're going to be able to tank damage, which is really effective, especially if the Protoss army made Stalkers. Since the Stalkers will probably target the SCVs, 3 reasons. The SCVs then can try to surround the Stalkers from retreating, and then what we're going to see here is one of the SCVs can start building bunkers, which can be really, really annoying, especially having this scouting information. So we're going to go to work here, right away, run cancel, and then bunker, and then we see now that's a follow-up of setting up this contain, and Binsky Light is, because there's no SCVs, he's able to push up. That's exactly what he was looking for. When these Marines were trapped, he targeted down the sentry, which enabled him to constantly put up this aggression. And since Binsky Light knows he's going to do aggression, he threw down a factory in which he's going to make Hellions out of. getting a starport immediately that you can take Marauders out of, and we're going to see this kind of footsie game for a while, but I want to point out that he then decides to do some... he tries to break the wall of Binsky Light, but this is what Binsky Light tries to do. LeBouf responds actually really well by moving some Stalkers and even warping in one to stop this drop, but this drop was able to try to drop the Hellions back behind the mineral line, which would have forced some of these units to pull back and handle if there wasn't a warp in. Can be very effective for moving around and kind of controlling the Protoss army. And it's a lot like kind of that chess game of positioning, or if in the fighting game community, that footsie play of finding the right line, and as soon as you overextend, you kind of pounce and take over. So this is going to get pulled off as 4 Stalkers are waiting for him. And I think ultimately Binsky Light wins the game by breaking the front and all that stuff, but those were the main topics that I wanted to point out, of just how he was able to do the 2 racks. He pushed out really aggressively. He was able to stop the Nexus that went down, and he even had a little soft / hard contain. It would have been a more hard contain if he threw down 2 or 3 bunkers to really deny the Protoss player from coming out again. Now we're just going to open up game 2, and we're mainly going to look at this from the Protoss perspective, in which it was my favorite build to do in PvT, which is the Void Ray kind of opening. And this is also from the CSL. All these VODs you can go on to, I think it's csl.com or something like that, and you can download the map packs and all this stuff. I forget which school. Oh, this is Purdue University. And so McComey is playing for Purdue, and he's going to do the Void Ray kind of push opening. So early scouting information, blah, 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 blah. And what JPEG does is he's going to do this Barracks Fast Expand, which McComey does some early harassment, and we've already eaten up another SCV, which is good. And walling off, from a Terran perspective, what does walling off do? From a Terran's perspective, if we wall off, we can start denying any further scouting, or in this case, we can trap a probe in. Whoop-de-doo. From a Protoss perspective, this makes Void Ray play even stronger. Since Void Rays have a range of 6, which outrange Marines, and Marauders don't hit air, so Void Rays are able to sit on these outskirts and start picking off the supply depot and getting charged, and Marines have to move down this ramp, to even start targeting this Void Ray. So if you are a Terran player that says, I'm going to wall off because that's just what I feel, I want to deny that scouting and all that other fun stuff, be weary of Void Ray plays then. Because the Protoss player, this is at the 3-minute mark, you haven't influenced his build at all, but you gave him a lot of information of what build he can do. Furthermore, if you wall off as Terran, that's also going to probably force the Protoss player in either doing the starport play, which we're going to see McComey do, or doing that gate robo-gate build, because he wants to get a very fast robotics bay to get an observer to look in your front, in which then your wall does absolutely nothing. I'm a bigger fan of doing what I like to call the power eye, in which you, let me just pull back, in which you build a supply depot 3 spaces above or away from this command center, and then throwing your barracks in between the command center and the supply depot. And this maximizes the surface area that is not exposed to that early probe harassment. So a lot of times I do not need to pull off an SCV because my SCV that's building the barracks is either hidden on this top supply depot or it's hidden on this command center. So the probe is actually doing nothing. And then I still feel pretty confident of holding off my front if I see a 3-gate or something like that to get bunkers either on the high ground if it's really fast, If they're doing like the one zealot, one stalker pressure, you can throw up a bunker here. But if you're doing like a gate expansion, you can even just start throwing the bunkers down here to zone them out. So I don't necessarily need this kind of opening. So things to be aware of is Terran. And now Protoss has already probably decided that he's doing Void Ray. And JPEG is doing the Rax gateway. Or Barracks Command Center. There are no gateways in Terran. I make that mistake all the time. We have a little scouting guy here. And now it is around the 4:30 mark. And we are throwing 4:40. We start the Stargate. So if you are a Terran player that wants to kind of have good map awareness and all that stuff, you can have your scouting SCV or even one of your first Marines to look for common proxy locations. And you're going to find it around this time. Just put in your hat. And if you're a Protoss player, this is when your Stargate needs to go down. And which is also a very common place to throw it, do the Stargate play on this map, because you can charge up on these rocks and then break this run. So that's also something to know with your Terran. If you have vision of these rocks, you may be able to tell, or even of these rocks, because they can charge here. A lot of variables. But so we have after the command center, we threw down 2 additional barracks to try to hold off any of this kind of early shenanigans. And this was very important. The stalker, even though it takes orange damage, it was able to delay this expansion even more. That is a huge victory, mainly because the Terran player is using the timing of this completing to unsupply cap them. So taking out that supply depot supply caps them, essentially. Now after these 2 barracks are done, luckily enough to stop them, more aggression from and realize now that Makomi is putting on all this pressure with just 1 gate. Protoss are able to really harass Terran players, and that's why I really recommend for lower league players to get really fast Marauders, or if you're at higher levels, to do the 2 Rax opening, because you get Marauders which stop that harassment and you can get map control instantly with it. If you do a Reaper opening, you just have a fast unit, but it will die to a Stalker as soon as it comes out. So I don't really recommend doing Reaper openings. What we're going to see in a little bit, we're having constant Marine kind of production. We do not have an eBay up at all. Usually my builds when I do Terran is I like to get my eBay up around the 6 to 6:30 mark to enable me to hold off any DTs if I think they're going that route, or to hold off the starport. I also get another barracks, but that's exciting. And now he's throwing just down a tech lab, which this is eating some time off the Marines. But the companies now has his 2, I completely forgot their name, Void Rays, and they're starting to charge up around the 7:30 mark. They were out around like the 7:15 mark, but since they had to do travel time and to be more effective to charge up, this is going to be very scary. And then with this proxy pylon, he's able to then warp in. This is still, well, I guess around 3 gameplays worth of units, but this is a very strong thing to hold. And so you may be watching this and say, well, he has 2 bunkers up and like a few spare Marines. He should be able to hold this off fairly well. We're going to see why that's. Guardian Shield, which we talked about, is a huge trouble unit. The Sentry, which is a huge trouble unit, throws down the Guardian Shield, which makes essentially all these units last forever. Having the pre-charge up on the Void Rays makes them take down the armored units, or buildings effectively, down extremely fast. So if SCVs weren't ready here, it's just going to die. As we saw, we only had 2 here, and I don't even think they were repairing this bunker, and it just dropped so fast. So right now, we just have Marines versus Stalkers and Void Rays, and we don't even really have that many Marines, because we were supply blocked now twice to pump out this stuff, and we have no eBay. Well, the eBay is just finishing. So we can consider this a late eBay as it's going to finish at the 8-minute mark. So if DTs hit us, we had to rely on scans, in which we have one scan now. Or we would have to have those turrets up, and the turrets are late. Now we just really start wondering, break down both this wall, as I previously said, very vulnerable to void rays. The void rays just demolished it completely, and the Marines are able to do nothing. JPEG is trying to frantically throw down turrets, but because it was just so late, and he effectively started these turrets as soon as the eBay was finished, they're still not going to be up in time. So to really hold off this push from a Terran perspective, as we saw all the benefits of getting a very fast Guardian shield, being able to have Stalker support, and the 2 Void Ray pushes charging up on the rocks, from the Terran perspective, we need to not only have those 2 barracks, we also need to have either SCVs ready to repair. We need to have turrets up before that hits, so like around the 7:30 mark. Even before then, like if our eBay finished at the 7-minute mark, we'd be really good. But yeah, or to a variation that I like is, as soon as you finish the Rax command center, you build 3 additional Raxes, and you just keep pumping Marines out, and get a fast +1 out of the engineering bay rather than getting a stim. So you're still using your gas, and actually his gas is out of control. So he actually got these 2 factories way too early in his build, mainly because he was just making mineral buildings and units. So that's something also to be worried about in your kind of build construction. So this kind of, I've been like highlighting things of missile turrets, not done yet. We're at the 8:30 mark when it was the GG. If you're walling off, you have to be wary of Void Ray pushes and Immortal pushes. This is what you're opening yourself up to. Probably not so much blinks and all that stuff, because they'll come later on anyways. But be wary of this. So you can either plant your barracks and supply depots away, you can do the power I if you like, but if you're doing a wall off build, you need more Marines or turrets or something before any of this can happen. And if you want to do the map kind of control, map awareness style, you either need to do the 2 Rax opening, which gets Marauders, who do a Marauder expand. Since as soon as you can even get 1 barracks making Marauders with concussive shell, Stalkers do not want to be anywhere near you, since in a straight up fight, Marauders will beat a Stalker 1-to-1, and Stalkers can no longer run away from a Marauder with concussive shell. Completely your playstyle if you want to play passive or aggressive, just your style. For a long time I did a defensive Marauder expand until I got more comfortable holding off all of the shenanigans. If you do a straight Marauder expand, you're much more likely to lose to a Void Ray push like this, or even an Immortal push, because all your units are Marauders. So it's mainly just something to be wary about. And also something to note, with a build, do not try to beat everything. This is kind of the statistical mindset which I was talking about in random variables. If you're doing this build and you want to beat everything, you're probably not going to. You can just hold off or completely crush builds, but don't expect to win everything with a certain build. If you do a 2 Rax, your opponent can actually do a robo opening and completely hold it off and push you all the way back, and kind of defeats the purpose of 2 Rax, and then contain you on one base forever. If he brings sentries, because you can then just keep force fielding your ramp, and you're then forced to get medevacs, and then kind of you risk dropping out of your base and all that fun stuff. So even though we saw a very successful to Rax, since the Protoss player was doing a fast expansion build, it punished that. In this case, we were doing a much more economic build. Even though we were a little late getting our factory tech and everything else, we clearly lost to a Void Ray play. So when you're doing a build, and like even builds that I say, like, oh, do a Marauder expand for you low-level players, don't come back to me in rage because you had someone Void Ray push you and you lose. Because that's just a bad counter build. Oh shit, I am skipping a lot. Nothing I can do about it. Hopefully my VODs are a lot clearer, but sorry about that. My internet's actually been really weird the past few days, in which just running Steam, like Steam alone, like Steam not doing any of its like 50 random upgrades, has just been lagging. 2 days ago it took me like 20 minutes to upload or not upload, but just to watch a YouTube video that was 8 minutes long, which was ridiculous. But when you're going into this kind of Terran matchup, especially looking at TVP, look at your options. Look at what you want to beat, or how to punish something, rather than try to defend everything, since ultimately you will not be able to defend everything. And in the same accord, you won't be able to win every game you play. That's why there's even pros out there that do not have 100% win average. It just doesn't happen. What I still highly recommend is pick 1 or 2 builds and really drill them. Really drill them, and then you can start mixing it up a little bit. So say I'm going to do an offensive Marauder expand on a small map like Zelnaga, but if I'm on Tal'Darim, which is a lot larger, I'm going to do a gasless expand. Very different kind of mindsets, but you can work on both. Also, what I would like to kind of add before I kind of close, well, not close the teaching section and open it up to any kind of questions, is, oh god, I just lost my thought. Oh, if you think you're getting very, very comfortable with something, like in TVP, if you're really down with getting your Marauder concussive shell kind of micro down, by that I mean targeting down individual units to slow more than one so you're able to take out a bunch, or if you're able to stutter step and snipe sentries really accurately without just doing stop micro and all that stuff, start getting out of your comfort zone and work on other skills. So if your Banshee control is phenomenal but you never do drops, just start trying to use drops more. That'll just start rounding out your play a little bit more. And if like your style says, whoa, I really just, no matter what, cannot do drops, that's fine. I just want you to go out and explore, or even work on your kind of weaker points sometime. That's more of the Eastern way of thought, of focus on what you're weakest at and improve on that, rather than saying, my stutter step is awesome and only do stutter step. Because the one instance that you're in a game and stutter step is irrelevant, then your entire playstyle is irrelevant. That's why you need at least a semi-well-rounded kind of style. That's not to say if you're always a defensive player, just randomly go all in. Vice versa, if you're a more hyper-aggression player, don't just sit idly for 4 bases, because you may know all these timings and things like that, but those change with later tier units out on the field. So if you're used to hitting before High Templars, but now you're waiting until High Templars are out, you probably don't know how to do storm splits, so you're going to just lose your entire army to storms. But that's just the last comment. So today we went over just kind of the good units you can make in Terran versus Protoss, what units to look out for and how to handle them. We talked about example builds, and that was effectively it. And then we talked about some of the Protoss builds and how to stop them, not just the units, but the builds itself, and when to look out for those timings. So I'm going to open up the questions now and see if there's anything to be asked. And if not, I could think of just one other thing to add, in which I was talking about with another Protoss player, I think a week ago or so. Since, I mean, I was a Zerg player for a long time, and then I switched over to Terran, but I think a lot of my mindset is still Zerg. Like, I still look at a matchup, and all I care about is just getting map control, and when I played Zerg, all I tried to focus on was getting map control with Zerglings or Mutas and things like that. So that heavily transferred over when I switch races. And I do a much more hyper-aggression kind of style. I don't try to win the game, in the first 6 minutes. I do rely on follow-up builds. But I was talking to a very passive player, Protoss player, and I wanted to ask how you wanted to do. Okay, so we have a question. What from I can read. PSC Nan, what is the best way to objectively label your weaker areas of play? Well, the best, since I'm biased of criticizing myself. Okay, well, the best objectively way of doing it is have someone watch some of your replays. Getting that practice partner, which I talked about on Theory Crafting Thursday last week of, oh god, I forgot the name of it, but episode 3 of Theory Crafting Thursday, of finding that practice partner. Or if like you don't have that practice partner and you're watching your replays, for Terran specifically, I went over a big list of the 7 areas of micro that you can work on, and if you're only using 3 of those, start using more. You can start watching pro games and start trying to use some of their strategies. For Terran, it's Marine splits, doing drops, Banshee harassment, Hellion harassment. You can even guess Thor's stomps of force fields and TVP. That can be tricky, but again, you can never use Thor's. How to do tank placements, that's also really, really big. Storm splits are really good for bio. And how to individually target down units while stutter stepping, that's also a big thing. So if you're not doing any of those, you can work on them. You can even watch a replay that you've won and watch a battle and said, what could I have done with my army to utilize them more? Should I have been able to do more stutter steps? Was it worth it? Type of thing. That's more of micro talking about rather than macroing. The easiest way to look at your macro is if your minerals are high, or if your gas is really high, like this game that we were just watching, I said, wow, he has a lot of gas. 470 may not be a lot of gas to a lot of players. That's an obscene amount of gas without having a single factory or anything else. Just having a tech lab and an eBay, and not even using the eBay, that is a ton of gas. This second gas, 100% entirely not needed for this build. So if we were analyzing this build, I would say don't get this at all. It's not needed at all. And actually, this 75 minerals could have gone into getting a faster eBay. This build is better then. That's very quickly how I would analyze this build, of just quick changes to do. But the best objective way to go back to your question is have someone else watch it. A lot of universities and even high schools now have little clubs or programs, or you can even go on Team Liquid and post some replays and ask for help and guidance and all that stuff. There's a ton of resources out now compared to when I was first starting to play Brood War and even Street Fighter and all that stuff. We didn't have nearly as much resources as we have now. So yeah, that's how to objectively look at weaknesses or anything else. Next question from FearDragon64. Hey buddy, what are your thoughts on Protoss dropping pylons to block the add-on area and Terran's Rax if they wall in? Do you think the scouting / delay is worth it? I'm just gonna rethink this again. I think. What are your thoughts on Protoss dropping pylons? I almost don't want to answer that question now. No. This is something that I was kind of thinking about very recently. You're talking about specifically blocking an add-on, not blocking like a wall in. Is that correct? Slots and Protoss dropping pylons to block add-on areas if they wall in. Like using the add-on to wall in. Alright, I'm first going to look at the question of using a pylon to block an add-on. It's a very Brood War kind of style, if I remember correctly. If Protoss players would plant pylons to block the add-ons for the structures in Brood War. But in StarCraft 2, I think it's worth it if you're going to try to cancel it, since what you're mainly going after, you're trying to delay getting the add-on, of course, but as soon as you see the barracks lift off, you've kind of already won that battle, and you can have the pylon build up to 99% and then cancel it. Having it finish, I don't think is worth it. Unless you're doing like a mad old school Korean 4-gate kind of pylon placements in which you're throwing down 5 pylons in your opponent's base, I would definitely cancel it, because you'll get some scouting information, and if anything, you're going to piss off the Terran player, especially if you've already delayed the barracks from being made, and then you say, haha, you can't even throw down an add-on. For 2 racks, that would help out a lot, just to kind of slow that down a little bit. For any kind of generic build, usually all my builds, I wait till I get 3 Marines out anyways, and I don't wall off. So if you throw down a pylon versus my barracks or factory or whatever, I'll be able to gun down the pylon even if it finishes before I even need one. The same philosophy is kind of with the gas. If you steal their gas real fast to prevent them from getting Banshees, yeah, you've eliminated kind of Banshee play for a little bit, but the Terran player can just kind of change their build. So if you're facing a good Terran player that is reactionary, it's bad to do. If you're playing like on ladder, and most people, even diamond level people, even some masters, are so statistical players, you'll piss them off just like a little bit and get under their skin. So it's more of a psychological move than anything else. You don't really gain too much from it. I think it's much more important to get that early probe in to do some harassment from either the SCV building, the supply depot, or the barracks. In TVP for the Protoss, I think scouting after dropping the pylon is so important, because you can start that harassment really early. And even if you're on 4-base maps, you get earlier scouting, and hopefully you can start that harassment earlier on. Now to block walls, which is the other way I read that question. So say in this game he was doing this wall, and we'll actually back forward a little bit. So he was doing this wall. If we used a pylon like to screw up, like even right here, so we always know what's in the front, we know if this barracks is going to lift off and get a tech lab or a reactor, that can be a little bit of information. Chances are that he'll just make 3 Marines and gun it down before any real information is kind of gathered. In this case, I think stealing the second gas is a little bit better, since you're going to be able to see what units, how many Marines he's going to bring over to steal this gas, and it eliminates some of the Terran builds. So I'd be much more inclined of just using the 75 minerals to steal a second gas compared to using a pylon to block either an add-on or a wall off. The only time I really would want you to use this pylon is nearly if immediately he lifted this barracks up. If he went supply depot barracks and he lifted this barracks up because he wanted to get a tech lab first, I would throw down a pylon here because they want to use this barracks, or most probably use this barracks to wall off and then get the full wall off. So you can throw down a pylon here and just really piss them off, because then the barracks should be trapped above the air for a while, and you can even then use your probe for as long as possible to delay having that barracks drop. And that's going to make them have fewer Marines, which is going to make your Zealot Stalker pressure even more effective. And if they're doing a Rax expansion, you should do so much damage that it would be funny. But bottom line, going back to the original question, it's more important if you're going to throw down a pylon in your base just to steal their second gas, and get some scouting information based on what units they bring to kill this gas and how quickly they do it. Because if they just let you have this gas for a long time, they're probably doing an expansion build. Probably. Now, if they're trying to get it done really fast, they're probably either doing a tank or banshee timing, and you at least delayed it a little bit by delaying the gas. So that's how I answer that question from the Protoss perspective. Really early Protoss harassment to Terran, as we saw a little bit Makomi do it with poking in with, and I've talked about it actually a few times, of getting some stalkers in here to just kind of pick off any Marines or slow down building command centers and all that jazz. But pretty standard items out of the one gateway. You get the one Zealot, one Stalker. In this instance, we have 2 Stalker harassment, which I still think is very, very good. If you want to skip that, it's all about your playstyle. This little aggression is really annoying. Not only has it delayed this expansion, but it's also slowed down this bunker, and most importantly, which I didn't point out in the battle, that we have a lot of pumpkin and red Marines. So when we actually do our stargate push, all these Marines are already injured. And as we can see, we hit before he even gets medevacs. And if we've scouted this command center, we know for a fact that we're going to hit before his medevac is out, or we're just going to hit as his first medevac is out. I'll just turn off the game sounds. Fine. But this is very really important, because if the Protoss player didn't do this early harassment, these Marines would have had more health for the Void Ray to deal with, and even the additional Stalkers to deal with, and all that fun jazz. So I highly encourage either harassing with a single Zealot and Stalker, or this 2 Stalker harassment, which follows up the probe harassment. And especially if you're able to pick off an SCB, you need to do follow-up harassment. You need to. I mean, I would almost really just even chrono boost out of the single gateway to really make sure I get that harassment out. And I mean, during this whole time, Clash was able to get a full scout of our base, but we're doing so much pressure already to the front that it doesn't matter. So sorry about the sound. I mean, this is a second attempt at trying to make things less loud, or not screw up, because we had that helicopter problem. So are there any additional questions related to TVP? This isn't going to be the only time I talk about TVP, but I just wanted to start kind of the general outline. Later on, if I do a TVP special, I'll probably be talking more about direct replays, how to be better versus a Protoss player, and it could be just quick little things like not getting this second gas and getting a faster eBay. This is a huge mistake, 100% huge mistake. If he was getting this fast second gas right now before even the tech lab throws down, which I think he starts like now. He even delays that. But as soon as you hit 100 gas, you need a factory. That's the only time you get 2 gas that fast. Only time. Yeah, so are there any other questions, or am I going to call it a night, have some water, and I have no idea. Today's Tuesday. Wait about a few more seconds for the stream lag. You're answering 2 questions. And yes, I need to start sending things to Reddit and Team Liquid saying that I'm doing this. I'll probably have a lot of trollers and all that stuff, but that's fine. More people, that's fine. And what I really need to start doing is not only doing those posts to both Team Liquid and okay, I like this question. When can you punish a Protoss for getting too many sentries? Well, as we talked about, if you're getting too many sentries, usually that becomes a problem when you're already on kind of 2-base play, in which then you would just make Thors or Banshees and just kind of push. You don't need both Thors and Banshees, just one or the other, since Guardian Shield is going to make your Marines essentially useless. But if you get enough of them with Stim, that'll help, especially if you have Thors stomping on force fields, which makes your Marines in range, and Banshees are always good. Another thing, especially if they're going mass spellcasters, so if they're going a lot of sentries or a lot of High Templar, you can start throwing in a lot of Hellions, since usually if you're doing spellcasters as Protoss, you're then going to get a lot of Zealots. So Hellions do really well versus Zealots, sentries, High Templar. So depending on how you're opened, because that's what really matters for Terran, it's really hard to tech switch if, say, like we opened up 3 racks and we spotted a sentry. We're probably not going to go up to Banshees. That's just going to be a way late transition. And so it would actually be a lot easier just to get like 2 factories, one making Hellions and one trying to tech up to Thors, or some variation along those lines. You can also use that Hellion drop kind of mechanic that I talked about before. So you can even just get 1 factory and then throw a reactor on it from one of your barracks that can make a reactor while your factory is made. Put about 2 Hellions at a time. By the time your starport finishes, you'll have 4 Hellions. And by the time the first medevac comes out, you'll have 6 Hellions. So you can move out with your 6 Hellions and like Marine Force at that time. And once you get to the wall and you see a lot of sentries, you can even then lift off your Hellions to harass the mineral line, which then splits up Protoss sentries, and then you can even pick off some sentries with the Hellions attacking from the front, since the sentries will then have to burn all the force fields essentially to surround themselves, in which then you just back off and wait till the force fields wore off and then engage again. That's what I would do. My nice little Oryx cup. All that some fun stuff. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna call it now. For the 3rd episode of Terran It Up. On Thursday, Theory Crafting Thursday, around 8 o'clock. The times haven't changed, I decided, since at first I was going to do Playheim like every day, but I realized if Playheim's every day, then 2 days out of the week I can devote to the show. So that's what I'm going to do. So Tuesdays, starting around 8, we're doing Terran It Up, and then Thursdays, around 8, we're doing Theory Crafting Thursday. This is all Eastern times. But on Theory Crafting Thursday, I think episode 4, we're going to be talking about sound and music, which should be a little interesting. It's kind of the theory of the game developers adding different sounds and musics into the game, and then we're going to talk about how incorporating outside music and sounds can help you either focus or get pumped up, and so on and so forth, while playing StarCraft 2, and how to actually use different alerts or audio cues, as well as accompanying them with visual cues of how to be a better macro player, micro player, and so on and so forth. I'll probably throw in more fighting game examples during Theory Crafting Thursday, since still most of my experience is in fighting games. So you just have to deal with that. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in. Of course, I'm Awmaface, and I'll see you guys next time.